Yeah, thanks for having me here. What I want to present today are basically excerpts from new work that I'm currently working on. So I'm returning to older research, which was on so-called lascars, Indian seafarers in the early 20th century. So I dropped that topic for some time, also because I thought there was such a lot of good literature on that already. So there's Balachandra's monograph on steamship labor, and a number of very good articles by various authors, including Jonathan Hislett's very good recent research on steamship workers. And for the earlier period, we also have a number of excellent studies, a monograph by Aaron Jaffer, for instance, and very good work by Michael Fisher and many others. So for some time, I thought I'd let it go. There it is. Then I had a few reasons not to do so and to come back to it. So I still think that there is a tendency to idealize the subaltern Indian seafarers' agencies. There's a tendency to talk about possibilities of agency that come out of a transnational work culture. And not to look very closely at the social relationship, not to look very closely at capital-labor relationships, which need to be considered more closely. This goes along with a tendency to focus more on the land than on the ship itself, on the workplace itself, which I think has not been studied very well. This is particularly true for the steam age, and there are reasons also for that. We have a number of studies that look closely at work processes on sailing ships, but not so much, and that is not only true for Indian history, but it's generally the case on steamship labor. Steamship labor appears to be a kind of invisible labor. There are reasons for that, but it also means that the labor relationships remain largely in the dark. There is a tendency also to idealize the motley crew and to belittle labor market segmentation that begins in the age of sail. And several of you may have read Amitav Ghosh's work, for instance. There was this essay in EPW where he basically summed up several of the ideas which are then more present in his novels also, and where there's the idea that for the first time you have this transnational motley workforce that experiences the world, experiences free labor even for the first time. So this kind of view, which I think does not even work extremely well for the age of sail. So if you read, for instance, Herman Melville's very biting satire on maritime racism, written in the 1850s, where he The Geese, that's the name basically of that short story, which I actually can recommend. Where he basically gives you the idea how labor market competition played out in all sorts of prejudices against each other between various groups of seafarers, even at that time. So even at the time of the motley crew, it didn't work too well. It works much less for the time of steamshipping. Okay. Racism is admitted to exist in some of the existing literature, but what we usually find is that the problem is confined to a problem of the white working class. And it's perhaps because this is so salient at the present, so that is a theme that is coming up such a lot in the US or in Europe, that I was drawn to it a bit closer, and more the project actually turned into one that explored the interdependency of class and race, and taking steamship labor as a starting point. And this is what the talk is mainly going to be about. So what I try to do with the project is to explore the entanglements and inseparability of race and class for the case of Indian seafarers. I use a term that has been introduced by the American labor historian David Roediger, who talks of racial management. That is, racism as constitutive of class relationships in many ways. And in many ways, one could deepen that idea by thinking of race as a concretization of the commodity logic in regard to labor. But that is something we perhaps can come back to in the discussion. Okay. So what I do mainly is to read out some excerpts from a text that is much too long to read out. It will still be long. So if you are getting tired, so you just tell me to shut up and we start the discussion. The twilight of shipping imperialism and the loss of a mail steamer. If British colonial imperialism had survived the Great War and the global revolutionary upheaval in its wake, the interwar years appear in hindsight as a period of Götterdämmerung, a period when the political and economic foundations of imperial predominance began to crack up. The twilight extended to the British shipping industry, which had served as a key infrastructure for imperial expansion in the latter half of the 19th century. It had risen to unrivaled global preeminence in the bargain. Between the world wars of the 20th century, this position began to slip. British merchant shipping suffered from the decline of British exports, continued to rely more than their competitors on a coal-based and decreasingly profitable steam technology, while the state subsidies it had been enjoying for almost a century were no longer sufficient to fend off their US, American, Japanese, and European rivals. The British share of world shipping tonnage plummeted from 50.1% in 1900 to 30% in 1930, while the US share rose from 4% to almost 16% in the same period. Even so, British shipping imperialists did not appear as a spent force in those years. The Great War had offered excellent business opportunities and high profits to British liner companies and other ship owners who were able therefore to quickly rebuild the severely decimated merchant fleet. Privileged access to the vast colonial empire and its trade networks continued to serve as a cushion for losses British shipping sustained elsewhere. The tendency towards oligopolistic mergers continued from the 1910s onwards to create ever larger shipping conglomerates. The most powerful of the British Big Five was the Peninsula and Oriental Shipping Company, P&O, after its merger in 1914 with the equally large British India Steam Navigation Company, BRI. In 1919, this concern accounted for more than 10% of the carrying capacity of the British merchant marine, or a quarter of the tonnage held by the 8 largest UK shipping conglomerates. The liner business, large passenger or cargo ships running on schedule that also provided the heavily subsidized mail services, was by then exclusively conducted by these 8 shipping concerns. The P&O Group's fortunes were most directly connected to Britain's colonial empire, as Euro-Asian trade constituted its main business. From the beginning of the First to the outbreak of the Second World War, the conglomerate appears to have accounted alone for between a quarter and a third of the total steamer tonnage carried at Indian ports. Not only government mail, but also troops and colonial officials, who made up for 2/3 of the company's passengers to India, were carried by the P&O, making it, as a historian of British shipping put it, in a large degree an unofficial arm of the Raj, deriving much of its income from the public purse. The chairman of the P&O Group since its merger with the BI, James Lyon Mackay, embodied British shipping imperialism like no other in this twilight period. From the 1890s onwards, Mackay served as a member of the Governor-General's Legislative Council, of the Secretary of State's Council of India, and on numerous government committees both in India and Britain. In 1909, he was in the race for the succession of the Viceroy of India, an office he was denied eventually. Mackay was compensated, however, with a peerage in 1911, after which he styled himself Lord Inchcape. Mackay Inchcape archetypically embodied the personal union between corporate and state imperialism, representing a business nexus that combined imperial shipping with a wide range of commercial and industrial operations in India. He was also a powerful player over more than 4 decades in shaping the Raj's as well as Britain's economic policies on fundamental issues like currency, state expenditure, or railways. Issues where the interests of British agency houses were at odds with those, among others, of rising Indian business concerns. The personal union of political and economic power also meant that shipping lords like Inchcape could maintain within their business an air of godlike managerial omnipotence in this period of imperial Götterdämmerung. Inchcape ruled the P&O group like an autocrat who held court at the largely ceremonial annual meetings of proprietors. So they paid generally a dividend of 10 to 12%, which meant that the proprietors were actually also quite happy with this style. So we cut this event short. It was only during the Great Depression and after Inchcape's death in 1932 that the strained financial situation of the conglomerate came out into the open. Creative accounting had concealed the diminished profitability of the company's liner business, declining liquidity, depleted depreciation funds, and a growing tendency to defer investments. Such liquidity crisis, concealed in some cases better than in others, clearly played a role when British shipping companies, including Inchcape's P&O, were more reluctant in the 1920s than their American, Japanese, or Scandinavian competitors to replace steam propulsion with diesel motors. Oil-fueled motor ships required higher initial investment than conventional coal-burning steamers, and their lower operation costs, also much lower labor costs, paid off only in due time. As a result, British shipping owners and builders lost the leadership in maritime technology they had possessed around the turn of the century. That Britain's dominance over world shipping was fraying at the edges thus became more clearly discernible over the 1920s. Inchcape, Doyen of the shipping lords, complained about hard times, unreasonably higher labor costs, and even as he assumed ever more powerful government assignments, undue state interference. This did not prevent him, however, from claiming for the P&O conglomerate a position of leadership and primacy, allowing them to set standards for the shipping industry at large. On the proprietors' meeting in December 1921, he smugly quoted from a letter from Lord Northcliffe, whose powerful press conglomerate included, among other newspapers, the Daily Mail and the Times. The media mogul thanked the shipping lord for the professionalism of the P&O's passenger services, which he had used extensively on his recent world tour, and attested that, quote, "So far I have found nothing but efficiency in the handling of the ships of your combine," unquote. This was more than complacent indulgence in the prevailing British self-celebration of superiority in all matters maritime. Significantly, Inchcape had assured the proprietors to protect, apart from their dividend, the company's public reputation as a key parameter of business success and stock market value. A few months later, however, a shipping disaster left a dent in the reputation and armor of the P&O. On 20th March 1922, the Royal Mail ship Egypt, on its way from London to Bombay, was about to leave the English Channel for the Bay of Biscay when it ran into a series of fog banks. The SS Egypt's third officer had the fog whistle sounded every 2 minutes, tried to pick up signals of other vessels on this busy shipping lane, though the fog would distort sound and hamper an exact localization of approaching ships. This is before radar. Built in 1897 for the P&O, the Egypt was an older, middle-sized, steel-hulled and coal-fueled passenger liner, about 150 meters long, with an internal volume of almost 8,000 tons and a depth of 10 meters between the upper deck and the bottom of the hold. Shortly before 7 p.m. and about 25 miles from Ouessant, an island off the coast of Brittany known to the British as Ushant, the fog thickened. The commanding officer reduced the ship's speed on hearing a faint whistle when a small French steamer, the SS Seine, emerged from the fog bank, hit the Egypt at right angles, tearing into its hull midships on the port side. The impact was all the greater since the Seine's bows had been reinforced to break ice on its winter voyages to the northern shores. After the collision, the Seine pulled back into the fog, damaged but maneuverable, while the Egypt's forward holds and boiler room were flooded almost at once. The ship went into a heavy list rapidly and sank within 20 minutes. The Egypt's passenger certificate permitted to carry 807 persons. passengers and crew, whose safety was provided for with 953 life jackets and 18 lifeboats capable of carrying 860 persons. The workforce required to operate a coal-fueled passenger liner like the Egypt was very large indeed. When the ship went down on 20th May 1922, its predominantly male crew consisted of 294 persons, more than a third of the certified passenger crew. 95 men were employed in the engine and boiler rooms alone, most as coal passers and firemen. 128 persons worked in the purser's department, mainly as stewards and also some stewardesses. 74, or only a quarter of the deck of the crew, were seamen in the conventional sense of the word and toiled in the deck department. The number of passengers on board was very small at the time of the accident. 14 first class and 30 second class passengers only due to the season, and since a larger number intended to board the ship later in Marseille for their voyage to Bombay. Thus there should have been an overabundance of safety gear to protect the 338 persons on board from drowning. Yet 87 persons did in fact not survive the shipwreck. 71, or nearly a quarter of the Egypt's crew, and 16 or more than a third of the passengers, mainly of the second class. That was a regular feature. The heavy death toll, as well as the loss of £1 million British pounds worth of gold and silver for the use of the government of India, directed at once considerable public attention to the shipping disaster. Almost exactly a decade after the much more deadly shipwreck of that much more famous Royal Navy ship, the Titanic, the Egypt disaster was clearly the stuff of newspaper headlines. It also led to a detailed Board of Trade inquiry into the reasons for the high loss of human lives, which was closely monitored by the press. The Red Commissioner's final report concluded with a severe censure of both the ship's officers and the P&O company, making the latter, as the British Indian Trade Commissioner put it, distinctly uneasy and eager to bury the incident in oblivion. The organic link between colonial imperialism and the British shipping industry was mirrored in the composition of the merchant navy's crews. In the interwar period, between a fourth and a third of the workforce employed on British merchant ships were recruited from the Indian subcontinent, while West Africa and Yemen also provided substantial numbers of non-European ship workers. If the loss of the SS Egypt did not remain a domestic British news item and provoke both intra-imperial and international public debate, this was even more due to the composition of its crew than to the occurrence of the accidents in French waters or to the P&O company's prominence in the shipping world. More than two-thirds of the Egypt's crew, 208 of 294 persons, all of them male, originated from the subcontinent. In the deck and engine departments, Indian Muslims, mainly from the west coast and from the northwestern regions. In the purser's department, predominantly Christians from the Portuguese colony of Goa. Deep down in the ship's steel hull below the waterline, the proportion of Indian ship workers was the highest. 83 of the 95 men tending to the ship's 4 triple expansion steam engines, namely the coal passers and firemen, were Indians, while only the engineers and a few skilled workers had been recruited from Britain. If coal-burning steamships had revolutionized shipping and facilitated an unprecedented growth of world trade in the latter half of the 19th century, even the technologically most advanced steamers continued to depend on large inputs of raw labor power, on labor processes that demanded the ravenous consumption of human muscle energy, of large amounts of labor power harnessed to simple tools and a narrow scope of repetitive operations. On an early 20th century steamer, it has been calculated, a fireman would shovel 2 tons of coal into a furnace every 4-hour watch, while keeping 2 watches per day. Such labor processes implied specific but limited communication and skill requirements. To keep up the steam, vast and renewable resources of raw labor were needed, marked out more than anything else by youth and physical resilience, for which India's often precarious smallholding peasantry provided a seemingly boundless supply base. Ship owners in Britain and elsewhere had valued Indian ship workers for decades as a cheaper workforce in terms of wages, food, ship accommodation, and compensation entitlements. Perhaps even more importantly, they were also appreciated as a workforce that could be subjected more easily to an uninterrupted labor process, demanded both by technology and the economy of the steamship, than the increasingly rights-conscious and rights-owning British jack tar. When British ship owners decided after the Great War not to invest in the most advanced and labor-saving diesel technology, in contrast to many of their international competitors, and competitors to push down further the cost of labor appeared even more compelling to them in order to compensate for the widening productivity gap. The proportion of Indian ship workers on British ships thus continued to grow, prompting British trade unionists, whether motivated by genuine jingoism, untroubled opportunism, or a combination of the two, to demand the exclusion from the maritime market, their exclusion. The post-war shipping crisis and consequently high levels of maritime unemployment had charged this debate with a new urgency. Campaigners for a wide prerogative to maritime employment appealed to a hegemonic, seemingly self-evident anthropological worldview, to a racist common sense. This common sense was shared on the one hand in varying degrees across most political persuasions and class divisions, not merely in Britain, but all along the North Atlantic rim. It was, on the other, rife with tensions and far from homogeneous, as racist assumptions could be intertwined with ideologies of class in various ways. Okay, so in the manuscript I spend a lot of time basically to demonstrate this racist common sense by tracing the press campaign that developed, that started in France, then spilled over the Atlantic, involved many parts of Europe, also reached India, led to an outcry, a nationalist outcry in India, to concern in the imperial establishment that political implications of the shipping scandal could become very bad for conditions in the Indian subcontinent, and that one had to tread very careful in the judicial inquiry. So that is a very long story which I cannot tell now. So it's also a very, very rich story, but I can just hint at that here and show some pictures basically which give some idea basically of the kind of press coverage and attention actually it got. So most of these are pictures referring to the ship accident. That is the Seine with its damaged bows. This is part of the British crew that was rescued far removed from the Indian crew. This is the only picture we get that I've been able to find in otherwise extremely rich material. Some passenger, the captain and the chief officer. Okay, what else? More interesting is the next picture that comes. Simply need to be the TV. Okay, so the press campaign began in France. The motive that became dominant very soon was the idea, basically, that Indian seafarers had taken the life jackets away from white women and children. So basically, that was the main story. Basically, that was basically spread all around the world. And that created the scandal, so I should have told that earlier. It would have made it much more understandable, and it also, created such an outcry in India itself. Okay, so and after the writers had finished, you got the illustrators that came into the picture, and so these are two sort of weekly journals that show you different aspects actually of that story. So there's of course the picture of white heroism, so the white gentleman who can't swim but still give his life vest to the lady. And there's some fighting in the background with the captain holding a revolver, trying to impose discipline, not too successfully. And here on this picture, even more interestingly, you see a number of armed, so these are supposed to be the Indian seafarers. So they wear clothes they would never have actually worn, but which make them out as seafarers. And they all wear turbans, of course, and they all shoot basically at battle-clad Europeans. So, okay, so that is actually the image that is being created. Okay. So after analyzing this campaign, I asked, so where are actually the images and the tropes that are being used in this campaign? Where are they actually coming from? What is their background? And I'm going to read out a bit of that, which moves us away a bit from that particular shipping accident. By then, maritime racism had postured as embarrassed truth-speaking for decades and in various garbs. Another form had been to sell it as a salty but profound popular wisdom. Then Niggers, again with inverted commas, was the title of a humorous piece published in London's gentlemanly Pall Mall Gazette in 1896. The author, presenting himself as a mariner of England, narrated an encounter with an old sailor, the conversation shifting quickly to the question why British shipping companies employed darkies or lascars. After displaying his own sophisticated eloquence, he put the following words into the sailor's mouth. Why? With huge contempt, because half a dozen of them sign on for less money than only one of us would sail for. And what's the result? Taking his pipe out of his mouth to give expression of his sentiment. Why, there's more passenger boats lost on account of these coolies than what you'd think for. It's only about 2 years ago, mister, that a big liner was lost off the Portuguese coast through about 50 of these fellows being benumbed and in a holy funk in a gale that any boat would have weathered if she'd been properly manned. You see, mister, in their own climate they work like horses, so why not keep them there? The common sense of imperialist societies thus had thrown up a repertoire of replicable racist images that was readily available when journalists strove to convert ship accidents into good content. In 1898, the New York Times covered the foundering of the Clan Drummond, suggesting that the details have also served as a warning of the danger which has been frequently pointed out of having large proportions of lascars in the crews of British vessels. The paper admitted that, quote, great reticence is maintained on the subject by their white interviews, indicating perhaps that some effort had to be made to reach the desired conclusion. Yet they stated that, quote, it appears that the lascars became panic-stricken and fought like demons. A survivor relates that several Europeans were drowned by being dragged down by frantic lascar coolies who lost all discipline. Reporting on the sinking of the Oceana, another P&O steamer in the English Channel almost exactly 10 years before the Egypt disaster, the Manchester Guardian too gave a standard account of the crew's behavior. Discipline among officers and the European crew was exemplary, but the lascars behaved like frightened chicken. The Daily Mail quoted a rescued passenger of the Oceana, an army captain, who opined that lascars did not behave badly for lascars, but they were simply petrified with blue funk. One of the ship's officers was reported to have confirmed that the lascars did not act so badly for black men. The repetition and invariability of certain representational features served to corroborate the argument that divine behavior in times of crisis was not ascribable to individual decisions but to racial essence. Lascars did not shout, for instance, when trying to save themselves from a sinking ship. They uttered unnerving howls, weird ear-piercing screams, or shrieked effetely. Not only did they forego any claim to manliness, they did not seem to possess any human individuality at all. Unless shepherded strictly, they strayed about as a headless, nameless flock from which neither culprits nor victims could be identified. And of course it was assumed that the panic-stricken native could not speak comprehensibly and sensibly, and that he had no individual voice to be taken account of. No need was felt to record their versions of the respective incidents. The consistent racializing but otherwise variable terminology used in British, Imperial and American contexts for referring to Indian seafarers facilitated this imputation of an unchanging and homogeneous collective identity. Lascar was used by the early 20th century as a term of British maritime law and public discourse that distinguished seafarers originating either from British India or South Asia at large from European and other non-European seamen. However, the term lascar could also be interpreted to apply to Indian deckhands only, in contrast to equally Indian firemen and steward. While its exact meaning shifted and was never conclusively defined, it was commonly understood that the word lascar signified a more comprehensively subordinated, substandard employment relationship and was thus combined or used interchangeably with the term coolie. Indian deckhands, on their part, did not usually refer to themselves as lascars, but as khalassis, a long-term established expression in the Indian Ocean shipping, signifying the free sailor. Even the first English and Hindustani naval dictionary, compiled by Thomas Roebuck in 1811, introduced lascar as a term of naval English, for which khalasi and karva were given as the Hindustani equivalents. A century later, the Anglo-Saxon press appeared to opt for the term native even more frequently than for lascar, however, when referring to Indian seafarers, thereby abstracting altogether from the employment relationship and focusing on ethnicity solely. As a term signifying racial subordination and a reduced entitlement to freedom, the epithet native appears to have been considered a better-mannered, publicable, utterable, and recordable alternative to the openly abusive nigger, the word routinely used by British officers and crew on board ship for Indian seafarers, so much so that some of the latter would refer to themselves, even in court, as kala admi or black man. Racism was a hegemonic ideology of the age of imperialism, and its hegemonic power, its status as an ideology that reached out from the ruling strata to large sections of the neighboring classes, reveals itself only if we take close account of its politer forms. It was the racism hiding between inverted commas while flaunting gentlemanly decorum that had the greatest political and regulatory impact, not the uncouth racism of the dockyards. But the hegemonic status of racism also implied that it had an important place in British working class life and politics. When the American journalist Whiting Williams took a tour of post-World War I Britain to explore the worker's mind, that's the title of the book we wrote, he met impoverished, underemployed men in London's Port District who felt aggrieved by Asian labour market competitors. So he quoted one, "See them lascars, the law's been letting the things and the chinks get the places on the boats that should belong to us." Plain pride. British seamen's unions had campaigned unsuccessfully against growing foreign and especially Indian labour market competition since the 1890s and would continue to do so well in the 1930s. In this, they had sought to mobilize public support, reverting at times more or less openly to jingoistic and racist rhetorics. Edward Tupper, one of the most well-known organizers of the National Sailors and Firemen's Union, thus recalled in his memoirs that the union's founder and Liberal Party politician, Joseph Havelock Wilson, had declared, quote, that over 25% of the men in the mercantile marine Asiatics of all kinds were not fit for the job and should never have been employed in the British service, unquote. As for himself, he believed that, quote, conditions have got to be bettered unless Great Britain wants to find itself with no merchant navy at all, or with a merchant navy run entirely by untrustworthy Asiatics. That British sailors were more difficult to control but superior in terms of courage in an emergency had already been asserted strongly by various witnesses in 1902 by the Mercantile Marine Committee. Yet positive evidence seemed hard to come by, and shipping companies led by the P&O eventually succeeded in thwarting employment restrictions. Seamen's unions continued to mobilize widespread anti-Asian resentment, for instance in May 1912, when they called for a national strike in the wake of the above-mentioned foundering of the Oceana in March and the much more deadly Titanic disaster a few weeks later. The Daily Herald, presenting itself as the voice of the British trade union movement, published a rousing leader supporting the call for a national seamen's strike. The leader condemned the slaughter of the steerage, namely the careless inadequacy of safety facilities on the Titanic, and demanded to enforce adequate work and safety conditions on board the ever more sizable liners. At the same time, it dealt side blows against disreputable socially or racially inferior competitors who underbid and drove out British sailors unfairly and violated thereby the latter's moral entitlement to a respectable place within the nation. Quote, Portsmouth and Plymouth drifters, loafers and criminals fresh from prison cells, Chinese and lascars, the filthy and diseased wrecks of the 5 continents are recruited to man British boats, while British sailors are left to tramp or starve or rot on the land because they demand a reasonable wage. A week later, strike action concentrated on the P&O company that was presented with a long list of demands for the improvement of employment conditions on board ship. The list combined similarly matters of safety equipment, payment, shore leave, and other work conditions with explicitly racial issues. The unions insisted that the accommodation of European stewards be provided apart from the Goanese, and raised at their first and key claim that, quote, 2 European seamen for each lifeboat be carried, unquote. Tom Chambers, presenting the case to the Daily Herald, defended this demand as being extremely moderate. Quote, we ask that there shall be 2 efficient seamen for each lifeboat carried on every ship, and this is the general public, as well as ourselves, were entitled to expect would have been conceded. I should have thought that the loss of life in the Oceana collision would have been a sufficient lesson to the P&O, considering the evidence of the passengers as to the conduct of the India crew in such difficult circumstances. He repeated that the safety of the general public demanded reform, and added, as further proof for the need of 2 efficient men for each lifeboat, that it was not unusual for lascars to sleep while on lookout duty. You also The Union's General Secretary Edmund Cadbury was quoted to have drawn the same connection between efficiency and Europeanness when commenting on lascars. Whatever these men, quote, whatever these men might be in ordinary circumstances, there is no doubt that when there was danger, they were too frightened to be of any use in life-saving. The emphasis on the safety of the general public allowed to represent the union's struggle not as a mere issue of class conflict that would not be met with much sympathy in a wider social arena, but as an issue of great importance to society as a whole, as a matter of nation, empire, and race. Trade union tactics were, in other words, adapted to the dominant ideologies of the time, whether out of conviction or from a desire to achieve inclusion and recognition at any cost. Hegemonic forces acknowledged such tactics, and that their objective could be deemed worth consideration. Quote, amongst other demands which appear to have been forwarded more or less under the wing of favourable opportunity, unquote, commented the Manchester Guardian. Quote again, that related to the manning of all lifeboats by 2 European seamen has attracted, and was no doubt meant to attract, attention and sympathy in quarters not usually well disposed to proposals of trade unions. Unquote. The Liberal paper accordingly proposed a parliamentary inquiry into the whole question of manning from the point of view of the safety of the life in passenger ships, since the decision on whether Indian seamen should be discriminated against on account of any natural disability could not be left to local branches of trade unions. The dilemma of tactical racism came out in the open immediately. when the possibility was admitted that trade union demands were in the public interest and for the greater good, these demands were not only raised to a higher, more respectable political level, but also removed from the sphere where trade unions could exert direct influence. At the end of the day, no major political force chose to meddle seriously with the recruitment policy of the empire's most powerful shipping concern. Between 1910 and 1925, the number of Indian seafarers employed in British merchant ship grew, in fact, from 44,000 to 55,000, while the total number of employed seafarers declined from 250 to 230,000. Attempts to trump class with race failed because both categories of social dominance continued to be folded into each other in the discourses and practices of the middling and upper classes. The extensive evidence presented to the Mercantile Marine Committee in 1904 provides ample material to demonstrate this point. Shipping officials and representatives of shipping companies sometimes agreed with opponents of lascar employment that British sailors were more muscular and more efficient, especially in situations of emergency and under cold climatic conditions. Yet issues of class were of even greater concern to them. The deterioration of discipline among increasingly rights-conscious British sailors, the blight of insubordination, as it was put by a campaigner for the shipping industry's position, was identified as the problem overshadowing all other labor issues. The sea lawyer, the British sailor who incited the crew to indiscipline, proclaimed demands on board ship and questioned the absolute power of the shipmaster, was the demon that tortured many of the witnesses. To him they returned frequently in their statements, and it was his very obstinacy that ultimately convinced them to put up with the strange lascar. The spectre of the sea lawyer emerged in the latter decades of the 19th century when trade unionism struck roots among British seafarers. Not only ship owners and sea captains were haunted by it, the sea lawyer also made appearance as a literary figure in narratives widely read among the British middle classes. One such narrative was Joseph Conrad's The Nigger of the Narcissus, published in 1897 and lauded by a recent critic as the first novel in his decade of brilliance. This sea tale was concerned with issues of race and class at the same time and merits, therefore, a short digression. The plot traces the making of a crisis of authority and discipline on board the Narcissus, a sailing vessel on its voyage from Bombay to London, and the resolution of that crisis, which restores the presumably natural community of the ship. Conrad presents the reader with two sources of disorder. One is Jim Waite, a black sailor who was signed on in Bombay to join an otherwise all-white crew, but turns out to be fatally diseased and unfit for work soon after the anchor is lifted. He is the nigger of the Narcissus. The other is, quote, a man with shifty eyes and a yellow hatchet face, unquote, called Donkin, who has also joined the ship in Bombay. He is the sea lawyer, introduced by Conrad as an abominable, cotton-speaking, Thersites-like figure. Quote, the man who can't do most things and won't do the rest. The pet of philanthropists and self-seeking landlubbers. The sympathetic and deserving creature that knows all about his rights but knows nothing about courage, of endurance, and of the unexpressed faith, of the unspoken loyalty that knits together a ship's company. The independent offspring of the ignoble freedom of the slums, full of disdain and hate for the austere servitude of the sea. Unquote. Hence, Donkin's introduction on the novel's opening pages comes with a programmatic refutation of Enlightenment values. Freedom and rights of labor are juxtaposed to servitude and duty, the former indicative of a degenerate, softened urban civilization, the latter to a harsh but vigorous natural order. Jim Waite's physical features are described in unabashedly racist terms. His face is, quote, pathetic and brutal, the tragic, the mysterious, the repulsive mask of a nigger's soul, unquote. Yet the black seafarer's role is not that of the stereotypically ludicrous Jim Crow of contemporary racism in the US South. Unlike the white crew, he speaks eloquently, even loftily, without accent, and his sharp intelligence is only marred by his refusal to accept imminent death. Instead, he undermines the ship's company by extracting cunningly in his diseased state an unnatural interracial solidarity, an unmanly solicitude from the white crew. Quote, he was demoralizing. Through him we were becoming highly humanized, tender, complex, excessively decadent. Unquote. An Irish sailor, quote, tended him, talked to him, was gentle as a woman, as tenderly gay as an old philanthropist, as sentimentally careful of his nigger as a model slave owner. Unquote. As a result, Jim Waite's moribund carcass becomes the fit emblem of their aspirations. Unquote. It alerts the crew to their own piteous condition, or to being, quote, oppressed by the injustice of the world, unquote, thus making them susceptible to Donkin's, quote, picturesque and filthy loquacity, unquote, that flows from a poison source. The vitalist defense of hierarchy, both of race and class, was the core of this discourse. Any indication of sentimentality on the part of the model slave owner, not to mention abolitionism, was a step towards the decadent, life-draining humanism of labor rights. Conrad deplored the demise of an older generation of, quote, men hard to manage but easy to inspire, voiceless men, but men enough to scorn in their hearts the sentimental voices that bewailed the hardness of their fate, unquote. The ancient sailor Singleton represented these inarticulate and indispensable, strong and mute men in the novel. An old salt who found it hard to count his pay, but possessed an intuitive, unthinking, yet deep understanding of the sea and of an organic shipboard hierarchy that was in consonance with the non-rational forces of the elements. Compassion and the morbid procedures of democratic reasoning, Conrad implied, were alien to a maritime realm that belonged to the brutal vitality of nature in its essence. Their application could only lead towards the doldrums, cause decadence, duplicity, and anarchy, as demonstrated by the pernicious duo of Waite and Donkin, the disgruntled nigger and the rebel-rousing lowlife who did not know their place. Conrad was not alone with his sentiment. He expressed widespread anxieties in a bourgeois Europe facing an unnerving radicalization of the Enlightenment call for equality, with workers who did not merely raise their voices but demanded voting rights and a redistribution of riches, some even aspiring fundamental transformation of the social order. Friedrich Nietzsche's Antichrist, written in 1888 but published only 2 years before The Nigger of the Narcissus, had expressed the same rage against the, quote, socialist rebel, the Chandala apostles who undermine the worker's instinct, his pleasure, his feeling of contentment with his little state of being, who make him envious, who teach him revengefulness, unquote. Like Conrad, Nietzsche had denounced egalitarianism as degradation and decadence. Quote, injustice never lies in unequal rights, it lies in the claim to equal rights, unquote. If the tone of Conrad's novel is any guide to British public opinion in the early 20th century, and it was hugely successful commercially, one should say, the strategy of trade unionists to conjure up racial bonds with their middle and upper class compatriots to exclude Asian and African competitors from the labor market was far from foolproof. It was in fact up against strong conservative anti-egalitarian currents that resented the abolition of British master and servant law in 1875, the efforts of philanthropists like Samuel Plimsoll and trade union organizers like Havelock Wilson to improve safety and working conditions on board ship, and the tyranny of the new unionism that struck roots among seamen from the late 1880s. The Toryism of that time conceived of British seafarers not as equal citizens, but as essentially unequal servants who rebelled against nature itself whenever they withdrew their silent, voiceless compliance. As a result, the wages of whiteness, the racial dividends union leaders like Havelock Wilson, Edmund Cavery, or Joseph Cotter claimed for white seamen more consistently on occasion of ship accidents, proved to be modest when they were paid out at all. Despite their efforts for, quote, for the elimination of Chinese lascars, crew boys, etc. from British ships, unquote, the proportion of seafarers employed under Asian agreements as lascars by the British merchant marine increased, as we have heard. The unrecognized champion of maritime Britishness at the helm of the seamen's unions bemoaned the apathy of the public and sought relief in compensatory deals with ship owners and the government. Their main achievement was that from 1911 onwards, employers deducted a part of the wages of all merchant seamen, including lascars and other non-domiciled seafarers, for contributions to the Royal Seamen's Pension Fund, while only domiciled seafarers, about 2/3 of the workforce, were entitled to collect the pensions. The union expressed their concern in the 1940s that the payment of the substantial subsidy to British seamen's income, the so-called lascar money, might cease together with colonial rule. The wages of solicitors' trade union imperialism were thus limited both in extent and time. In the eyes of a conservative public, Donkin hardly rose to the status of a respectable compatriot when he turned against Wade. Nor would explosive Joe Potter, the leader of the Amalgamated Maritime Workers Union, be rewarded for his vitriolic attacks on Indian seafarers during the Egypt inquiry. Okay. So, what I cannot do at all today is to get into the inquiry at all, which is a sort of enormous amount of material, including numerous witness accounts. There was no way to get around Indian witnesses because the scandal had been so big also in India. There were 8 Indian witnesses, each of whom made 3 different statements, which were partly, which we only have in translation, but in extremely careful translation, rendered by a very unusual London missionary who had been among lascars for almost 3 decades and had represented them also at earlier periods. So this is extremely rich material. So what we find out, the picture we get of what happened actually during this accident, to sum that up very clearly to give you just a sort of rough idea, is that the Indian seafarers on the Egypt did not have any lifeboats. So when the accident occurred, and most of them had not been assigned to a specific lifeboat, which was totally against all regulations. Okay, the Khalasi Serang was sent off with the first boat, which may have led to a breakdown in the chain of command among the crucial deck crew. That's the second finding. The officers may at first have underrated the severity of the damage, which would even be understandable. So nobody could know that you had this ship with reinforced bows actually, that this had caused such a damage. And it seemed to have discouraged also the lascars to do anything. So the officers also made little effort to involve the Indian seafarers in the rescue operations once they had started, whether actively. So basically, you had the Indian sailors assembling on the officers' deck, asking for commands and being unable to get commands at that point, nor also passively. So the picture that emerges is one of panic across the board, basically on that ship in these last 20 minutes before it went down, but which was apparently increased by the impression that black lives did not really matter. Okay, so that's a sort of, it's so crude I can't tell you, yeah? But this is what I can do at the moment, and I want to do something else at the end of this talk. Okay. So there are various, so as we analyze this material, we get to various interesting points concerning the everyday hierarchy on board ship and the work process, how they were organized, and the relations between different elements and segments of the crew, which usually remain invisible. They refer both to the question of communication, limits of communication between different segments of the crew, and also of limitations of cooperation that were necessary under regular circumstances and also possible then under other circumstances. So that is a long discussion, and I can only look at one aspect here. That's the aspect of communication, which I simply basically end. But basically, the story goes on and goes much deeper than I can explain today. British trade unionists, supported by sections of the British public, had used for long and would continue to use for many years the argument of linguistic barriers to substantiate their claim that the employment of lascars involved high risk, especially in emergency situations, and should be restricted for this reason. However, the use of the argument for exclusionary purposes does not disprove by itself the validity of the claim that restricted communication channels among the crew created additional safety risks in times of emergency. The claim needs to be examined on its own terms and not merely in regard to the interests it was utilized for. Okay. So, source. So this was an anonymous letter which you'll find in the judicial records, which was sent to the Solicitor General, possibly by a member of the white crew. Sounds a bit like that. Dear Solicitor General, you are probably aware of the cause of the trouble, perhaps you are not. Language. Lascars, native Indian language, Gujarati or other Indian languages. Lascars also speak a few words of Hindustani lingua franca. P&O officers speak a few words of Hindustani and no other Indian language. They are not required by company to pass any language test. They could not write or read the names of crew in any Indian language. Now you have some P&O officers in the box who swore they spoke the native language. We call all of them and ask if they will act as interpreters when you examine the lascar witnesses. Ask them to write a native man's name. Ask them to say to the lascars, there's no need for alarm, keep calm, do exactly as you are told, and everyone will be safe. If you disobey, I will shoot you. The fact is, there is only one medium of communication between officers and lascars, the translator, the sarang. There is only one of them. The lascars did nothing. They were waiting for orders, but the sarang could not be everywhere. Okay? So there are all sorts of assumptions actually in that letter, but this is how the problem actually was staged. It did not play such a big role actually in the court. We can discuss actually. So the sarang found out was sent away with the first boat that left the ship, basically. So that is something I've mentioned actually already, which may have been one of the critical points where actually the communication link actually snapped. When the sarang went, the linguistic tie between the chief officer and the lascar crew snapped. The chain of command broke. The Khalasis were either ignored or dismissed. Neither had they been provided with life jackets, nor were they given meaningful orders, which may well have created the impression among the Indian crew that the task of securing their survival was rather low on the list of priority of the white officers. Our evidence suggests that the collapse of communication may have raised to an extension level the suspicion of racial subordination, a suspicion that was nurtured by a structure of racial management Indian seafarers had been subjected to whenever they signed up on a British steamer. We can reconstruct the expectation which British shipping concerns employing large numbers of Indian crew had in regard to the language skills of their officers. In the course of the Egypt inquiry, the representative of the P&O assured variously that they expected an adequate knowledge of lascari lascar argot from their officers, and that a lack of that knowledge could be an impediment to promotion. Yet it is also evident that a limited importance was assigned to the issue at best, as there was no formal procedure of examination. The matter gained public attention as the P&O and the P&O management took notice, for instance, of a letter to the Dundee Advertiser written apparently by an old India hand who declared that in 20 voyages between Britain and India, quote, in not a single instance have I run into ship's officers who had anything but the very merest acquaintance with colloquial Hindustani, unquote. The letter writer referred to the practice of some of the major railway companies in India who demanded that officers were to, quote, pass the colloquial test within 18 months of his appointment, and recommended a similar regulation for the merchant marine. A Royal Navy officer, Lieutenant Commander Frederick Southwell Piper, wrote to the P&O chairman with a proposal for the establishment by the company of a school of instruction in lascari in London, recommending himself as a qualified teacher. The managing directors did not waste time on considering the offer. They declined with polite promptness. Primers and dictionaries of lascari had been published in Britain for more than a century, the first being Thomas Roebuck's English and Hindustani Naval Dictionary of 1811. Apart from a short grammar of Hindustani, this volume contained a list of technical vocabulary and of sea phrases, the key commands required to navigate a sailing vessel. This dictionary had been compiled with the help of a British shipmasters with decades of experience in the Indian Ocean country trade, and crucially, of 4 equally seasoned Indian serangs, all of them bearing Muslim names but originating from various shores of the subcontinent. Mainly from the west coast, Kutch, Gogha in Gujarat, Kolaba on the Konkani coast, but also from Chittagong in Bengal. The dictionary reflected in its own specific form the communication patterns, problems, and needs of an age of sail, when the proverbial motley crew consisting of sailors who originated from anywhere between Sumatra and East Africa was still the rule. This was a time when sailors needed to know the ropes of a sailing ship. This complex, multi-partite, early modern machine was mirrored in an equally intricate vocabulary. The vocabulary had roots in various Indian languages as well as in naval English, but contained also numerous words of Portuguese origin. Iberian maritime technology had been appropriated by Indian ocean shipbuilders for centuries, and its terminology had entered a lingua franca understood by sailors across this extended maritime landscape. Yet Amitav Ghosh has pointed out rightly that Roebuck's dictionary hardly provided a key to that link language. Rather, it combined a vocabulary of multiple linguistic roots with a grammar of North Indian Hindustani to create a language of command, a means of unidirectional communication that British officers could acquire quickly and that allowed them to manage their Indian Ocean crews effectively. Hence, according to its extended title, the book was, quote, calculated to enable the officers of the Honourable East India Company and Country Service to give their orders to lascars with that exactness and promptitude which upon many occasions must prove of the greatest importance, unquote. something for early 19th and 18th century titles. The section of the verbs of the short grammar introducing the dictionary began quite consistently with the following sentence, quote, "The imperative in the second person singular is the root of every verb in the Hindustani language, and it is this portion of the verb which is most required by the officers and others in giving their commands to the lascars." Roebuck's dictionary thus combined a glossary of maritime hardware, mainly nouns denominating the parts of a sailing vessel and its rigging, with verbs in their imperative form. Lascaribad then was a specialized and simplified language of command akin to the Latinized military Hindustani that was studied and used by British officers of the British and Indian Army during that period. Patterns of lived communication went beyond this narrowly restricted language of command, however, and we can also assume that multilingualism was not uncommon among skilled Indian sailors who spent their working lives among motley crews, along with long waiting periods in foreign ports. Herman Melville recalled, for instance, that he had encountered in his seafaring days in the 1830s several men who spoke very good English, among them the crew of an India-built British sailing vessel, the country boat Ravi. He particularly remembered in graphic detail a long conversation on matters of shipbuilding with one of the Indian sailors. Roebuck's dictionary was revised, enlarged, and republished numerous times, the most extensive edition being that of 1882 by George Small, a missionary associated with the Asiatic Strangers' Home in Limehouse, London. By then, the sailing vessel was increasingly being replaced by the steamship, which went along with an archetypical industrial process of descaling and rescaling that affected large parts of the crew. Quite strikingly, the technical vocabulary of Small's Dictionary of Lascaribad remained unaffected by these momentous technological changes. It continued to provide translation for every sail, spar, and rope, but maintained a curious silence on the gratings, brakes, and flame tubes of the boiler room. When Norwood Harrison's Manual of Lascari Hindustani appeared in its 5th edition in 1928, the age of sail was positively over, and diesel-fueled motor ships were progressively replacing the once revolutionary coal-burning steamer. The two revolutions of shipping technologies had had little impact, however, on the vocabulary. The ship's changed hierarchy of command was taken account of Bara Mistri Saab, roughly the great master technician, so being the title invented for the chief engineer, but the technical vocabulary remained that of the age of sail. Even though Harrison claimed that the book was written more especially for the use of officers and engineers of steamers carrying lascar crews, its reduced engagement with technical terms allowed to extend the readership to, quote, those who have the management of lascars and of other uneducated natives in British India, quote, and include decidedly non-maritime yet apparently useful Hindustani translation of sentences like, I want a solar hat, coachman go back to the hotel, or shikari, is there any game near here? If even naval dictionaries lost much of their maritime specialty, this may well have reflected the transformed and altogether reduced communication requirements on board 20th century ships. Everyday work processes were less complex and communication intensive. While the sailor of old days had to know the numerous parts of the ship's rigging by name to follow the mate's orders, the firemen used a small variety of tools to stoke the boilers with sound signals, often replacing verbal commands to a large extent. Even the deck crew's range of tasks had been narrowed down considerably, which made it less problematic to channelize much of the communication required on a day-to-day basis through middlemen translators, the much-quoted servants and tindlers. The division of labor on board ship was also much deeper now, and skill profiles less homogeneous. From the point of view of work organization, there was little need for communication, for instance, between the crews on deck and in the engine room. from the point of view of labor discipline, there were even valid reasons to keep them apart and discourage fraternization between the departments. The management required of a steamer thus allowed much more than those of a sailing vessel to divide up the workplace into segments and erect what might be called a structure of social bulkheads. These divisions could be defined racially, as they often were, and coincide with the linguistic partition of the crew. White sailors would generally communicate in English, while their Indian counterparts would converse in South Asian languages. As a result, the social and linguistic lines of segmentation tended to reinforce each other, as gangs of lascars and other native seamen were recruited to a large extent through specific ethnic networks. The motley crew of the Age of Sail lost much of its diversity, and with it the need for a living maritime lingua franca, for an experimental, improvised mode of overcoming impasses of communication. Nor was it for the same reason as likely in the 1920s to encounter among the Indian crew of a British ship several men who spoke very good English, as in Herman Melville's time. By the time of the First World War, in contrast, the acquaintance with a very small number of English words could qualify a young coal trimmer on a British steamer to be elected the spokesman of an aggrieved Indian crew, as Amir Haider Khan recalled in his memoirs. When the daily work schedule of the steamer was shattered by an accident, and if the emergency routines had not been exercised previously, as in the case of the Egypt, the limitations became visible of communication patterns that had been shaped under the double impact of maritime industrialization and British imperialism. Considerations of profitability and managerial efficiency clashed with the communication needs in a moment of crisis. The multiple communication gaps within steamship crews may not have had advantages even under everyday conditions from the point of view of racial management. When the Egypt sank, however, these carefully managed gaps did not facilitate or accelerate rescue operations. In this sense, British trade unionists hit a raw nerve when they brought up the issue of language, even if their exclusionary deductions oozed with white supremacism and a narrowly conceived self-interest.